Hello and welcome back. My name is Sydney Bell, and I'm the program lead for the Ontario Network of CAPC CPNP projects. And we are here today at our last session of day one of our conference. And we're moving into our keynote session with our very special guest, Denise Findlay, who has joined us. And she also has Chanel Bath with her. And really just want to welcome the both of you to our session here this afternoon. And I'll just hand things over to you. And if you need me, just let me know. I'll be off camera, but I am here. And thank you very much for coming in and speaking to us today. And over to you, Denise and Chanel.
Thanks, Sydney. If questions come in, just feel free to sort of interject so we can integrate people's
Okay,
questions right into the session.
sure.
We like to be fluid in how we handle that. I just want to start by saying Hat Squal Tanoyap, Unsalkalia, Denise Quiensna, Tana, Chenpla, Homalchison, Hochameos, Gohomish Chen. I'm Salkalia. My English given name is Denise Findlay, and I belong to the Squamish Nation here on the west coast of BC, and I live in the village of Homalchison, which is the place that my ancestors actually also lived. And I'm very happy to be speaking to you today from the coast. It stopped raining and the sun has come out, and so we can feel spring. Maybe I shouldn't say that to folks from a province where spring comes much later, but it feels like spring is en route here. I'd like to give Chanel an opportunity to introduce herself as well, but I have a gentle invitation to everyone, and I know that when we do these larger conferences online, that it's quite common to keep our cameras off. Something I learned when I was teaching in Indigenous studies at SFU from Dr. Joyce Schneider, who's an Indigenous scholar there, is that when we're talking about Indigenous worldviews and colonial harms, that to keep our cameras off, it's really difficult for us to read what's going on with people. So it's a sign of respect to put the camera on, and it humanizes the work that we do. Thank you. Now, I understand that for some people, you may choose not to, and that's okay. Or there's a reason that you can't, and I understand that. But if you can, I really encourage that because then we can see your beautiful faces and all the facial expressions that we need to be able to read to receive and send signals. So I'm the creator of Gathering Our Medicine. It's really a synthesis of my entire life's work. I originally developed a parenting program using the Gathering Our Medicine framework for the Maples Adolescent Treatment Center about 6 years ago. I was called on to come there to develop an Indigenous program to support families and communities who were sending Indigenous youth to the Maples because they were experiencing moderate to severe mental health challenges. And that's where I met Chanel. We've since moved on from the Maples, and the framework has really evolved into um, something that is helping not only communities, but we have a partnership with Foundry BC, which is a one-stop shop for adolescent youth health and mental health. We're working with a number of delegated agencies. We're working in education, social work, the health field, the medical field. It's a framework that's really helping folks reconceptualize the delivery of services so that they're truly decolonized, and so that decolonization and indigenization efforts aren't happening on the side, which is often what they do in mental health. We have the dominant paradigm, and we have this sense that culture is good, and we have this sense that community is important, but we don't always know how to integrate those two worldviews. What typically happens is the dominant worldview eclipses and reduces Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Um, to the point where they're sort of just happening as a nice to have on the side, and we're not really able to see how kinship, community, and culture can provide very naturally the conditions for healing and well-being, not only for young people, but for families. I'm just finishing my PhD. I'm doing my defense on March 24th at SFU, and I have a faculty position with the Neufeld Institute. So I've been under the mentorship of the world-renowned developmental psychologist, Dr. Gordon Neufeld, for about 14 years. And so I bring all this lived experience working in communities, working in the mental health field, working in the health field, and then my own educational journey and my own experiences as a person of mixed race, Squamish, as well as European ancestry. So anytime I get invited to talk about gathering our medicine to people, I get excited that it's an introductory conversation. These are new ideas. And I will tell you now that there's always more to talk about than what we have time for. And even though I've provided all these slides and I've prepared, we may not get through it all, and that's okay. We'll get to where we need to get to. And I invite you to type the questions into the chat and interact with us. If something pops into your mind or heart, feel free to ask the question. Chanel, did you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Denise. Hot squile, everyone. Chanse, Chanel Nitzigason, Nia Ochwapso Sipi, Nia Och Papas Chase. Hello, everyone. My name is Chanel Bath, and I come from the Cree Nation on my mother's side, Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territories. And I'm also of mixed ancestry. And so my dad's ancestry is mostly from England and Spain. A little bit about me is that typically I'm at home. This morning is a little bit different, but I'm joining the call from, I typically join from my home on Coquitlam First Nation territory. And I've been there for about the past 12 years. And so it's a really special place to me. It was shared with me that the name of the place where I live is called Simiqua'el'a, and that means the place of the great blue heron, and it's a place of healing and safe harbor. And I just learned that in recent years, and I thought that that was really beautiful, just knowing my own educational journey and family reconnecting and all sorts of beautiful things. My work at the Maples all happened in this beautiful place on Coquitlam First Nation territory. A little bit more about me that I'd just like to share is that I've spent the past 12 years working in support of Indigenous young people in a variety of different ways, mostly around mental health services. And sort of, I think Denise so beautifully described how there's this dominant paradigm that where we're trying to add these pieces of culture or community, and might be doing that in a way, or I can only speak for myself, in a very clumsy way. And so about 5 years ago, I met Denise and was introduced to Gathering Our Medicine. And it was the beginning of really reconceptualizing for myself how I could work in support of Indigenous youth and their families. A little bit different than what I had been doing, and so much possibilities opened up as a result. So anytime Denise invites me to come and share, I'm there. I feel really strongly about Gathering Our Medicine, the framework, and just relational practice. And so delighted to be here in your circle today, and looking forward to spending this time with you. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks, Chanel. That was great. That's a good segue, what you said about relational practice. That is something that we talk about a lot in Gathering Our Medicine. And we know, the research tells us that relationship is the intervention. It's not the modality. It's not our intelligence. It's not our skill set, but it's actually our capacity to form a meaningful, psychologically, emotionally safe relationship with someone. Once we do that, the relationship actually becomes therapeutic, regardless of the role that you have with a young person or with a family. I often think back to my growing up years and feeling like the janitor in my elementary school was the safest person there. And so that was the therapeutic relationship that I had in elementary school, as did many kids, because that janitor didn't have a role with people. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. It's not that we want to dismiss or throw away all of the skills and the education that people have. I think the problem is that education has eclipsed our intuitions about what it means to be relational and how foundational this actually is. And sometimes we're working at helping people outside of a relational context, and it feels like we're paddling upstream. Uh, we often talk about gathering our medicine as a journey from our heads to our hearts. And that was something that a beautiful Cree elder by the name of Kathy Lewis, way back at the beginning of my journey, when I thought I knew things and I really didn't know very much, she said to me, she said, the longest journey you'll ever take is the one from your head to your heart. And I think we need to take the journey from the head to the heart, and then we need to find an integration point between those two things to be good at what we do and helping anyone, regardless of our field of practice. And I've included this beautiful quote by Chief Dan George, who is an ancestor of mine, local Tsleil-Waututh elder and chief who was quite prolific. He was an actor back in the day, and he was a prolific writer, and he wrote poetry, and he talked about our way of life as Stolmoth and as Indigenous people being very relational, and that there was this beautiful interdependence. And in this particular quote that I like to share, he's talking about love. And what I find really astounding about that is that when Chief Dan George wrote this, he didn't have any clinical training. And yet, if you read that passage, what you will see is that he's getting to what we call in our field the pathogenesis of the problem, which is the emotional root of most problems people have. It's rooted in emotion. Um, and so he was brilliant in this. He didn't need the training. Many of our wise elders and many intuitive people know this. It's only when we've forgotten this way that we need to be reminded and have this conversation, which makes having this conversation a little bit clumsy because we're talking about things that we were never meant to talk about. We're talking about things that should be innate. But because of the impacts of colonialism and the dominant worldview, and I want to say this very lovingly, that we are all embedded in a dominant worldview that is progress oriented, not relationally oriented. And so it doesn't matter what walk of life we come from, whether we're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we've all been impacted by that dominant worldview. And that dominant worldview includes all the isms: colonialism, classism, sexism, genderism, racism. It includes all of those things. It's a worldview that is about progress, and it's not about connection and relationality. And that's why Indigenous worldviews are so valuable at this time in history and so very needed. But making that shift is that journey from the head to the heart. Chanel, if you want to pop in, just give me the signal. And Sydney, if there's any questions coming in, just give me the signal and we'll pause. Some of the ways that gathering our medicine is shifting the mental health landscape is through the decentering of experts, or practitioners, and a reorientation of people with professional training as walking alongside Indigenous families and communities to help facilitate a healing process and a strengthening of kinship relationships. So the focus is not on the expert as having all the answers, but as someone who is actually helping repair intergenerational trauma and the intergenerational ruptures between not only parents and children and elders and kinship, but with the land, with the ancestors, and with the distinct cultural ways of being, knowledges that exist within our communities. Now, I'm from British Columbia, and we have the most diverse population of Indigenous peoples, which means we have over 300 different dialects and knowledge systems here. So we have the most in all of Canada. And so that means that how one community does things is very different than how another community does things. And so we intentionally created the framework so that it couldn't be standardizable, and that it invited practitioners to look at the particular ways of the people that they serve and to develop relationship with those folks who carry the knowledge about how to do things in a good way. Each and every community will have long-standing traditions. And for me as a Squamish person, 14,000 years worth of knowledge about how to be a good relative, how to take care of each other, and how to facilitate development and the reaching of human potential in culturally distinct ways. And so it resists the dominant mental health paradigm in that we aren't centering a one way of being in the world and a single definition of mental wellness and well-being. Each community will have their own narratives and their own definitions of what it means to be human and what it means to be alive in the world today. We're empowering community and kinship, which means that we're bringing in people from community and we're holding them up as the best medicine for their own people and their families. And we're supporting them to not just share knowledge, because this is something Chanel often talks about. Like, we know culture's healing, but sometimes culture can also be a site of great harm for people. And so the way that we're inviting knowledge keepers and elders and people with teachings and language into the space is in relationship to their own people. So it's not just about the act of doing something cultural. It's about culture facilitating a restoration of endearing relationships between relatives and community, because one of the most, I think, detrimental and cascading effects of intergenerational trauma is the rupture of relationships between families and generations really of parents that we're still seeing today, who don't necessarily feel that they are equipped to provide what their children need and that experts know better than they do. I think Chanel and I could probably tell you a lot of stories, that we don't have time today to do that, where well-intentioned professionals actually end up creating a great divide in families by centering themselves as the answer. And so it's just a little bit of a shift and a reorientation. Some work that we've done with a local nation here has really invited the elders and the knowledge carriers to reimagine narratives of well-being using their own language, using their own stories, and using their own land-based practices. The research tells us around Indigenous healing, and the research on Indigenous healing is vast, but what it tells us is that Indigenous peoples need culturally affirming narratives. This is so important to a sense of identity, and that developmental process that gets stuck because of intergenerational trauma, and that gets stuck when young people are subjected to a worldview that feels foreign. We have to alter ourselves to fit into a way of being that feels unnatural, if you will. And that's something Gregory Coyote refers to as ethnostress. The not standardizable piece is important because it is a transcultural framework, and I'm going to show you the framework in a moment. But depending on where it is, it looks different in every single place, as it should. And this is challenging within a dominant worldview where we're always looking at how to upscale things and standardize things. So I just want to invite you to contemplate this list, which is just a very partial list of all of the modalities one can be trained in to be considered a legitimate helper. To be a helper, we get this training, we become qualified as a helper, we get to put a nameplate on our desk or on our door, we get to put credentials after our name that qualify us to deal with human suffering. And I know here's the secret's out. We all know, those of us that are helpers, none of us is prepared to deal with the level of human suffering that we encounter in our roles. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the big secret that we all, like the imposter syndrome thing, is that we know to some extent that there's only so much we can do. But the point is that when we're working within families and communities, and we're working with professionals who are supporting our families and communities, we're wanting to differentiate um, the dominant way of approaching suffering from a more relational way and a community-centered way, a healing-centered way of dealing with suffering. It really has nothing to do with what you're trained in. And I want to ask everyone a quick question. So, as helpers, and I'm guilty, by the way, as helpers and practitioners and perhaps even experts, when we are trained in a particular modality and we are very attached to that way of doing something or a particular theory, um, and it doesn't work, or we try it and it's not working, what is the tendency? Sort of what do we do when something doesn't work or it doesn't seem to be working? Can anyone want to type it in the chat, or you can say it? You can pop your mic on. What tends to be our go-to when something we've been taught to do that we're told is evidence-based and should work doesn't work?
Well, Denise, we might think that the person isn't doing it right, or they're that awful word of non-compliant. I've heard
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that fact? It's something's wrong with the client. They're not doing
Right,
what we need them to do.
right.
Or I just maybe I'm not doing it right and I need to try harder. Or
Yeah,
maybe I
yeah.
need to take more training.
More training. Yeah.
If I
Yeah.
just get one more course under my belt, I'll know how to do it. And what we're suggesting that is that um, it's not necessarily that, it's that we haven't been effective at gathering another human being into the kind of relational context in which they would be receptive to one's care. And we're often working with people who we have not rendered receptive. I often will tell the story of me in grade one, which was a very long time ago, by the way, uh, and having had immense trauma in my life and just going to school. And I was at that time selectively mute, which they didn't have that label back then, of course. Um, and just just surviving really on a day-to-day basis, barely. And I remember I still have my grade one report card, and the report card said, the teacher said, Denise is a very quiet member of our class. As a matter of fact, she never speaks at all. Um, and if I were to rewrite, if I was to go back in time and reframe that for that teacher to rewrite, I probably would have asked her to write something like, um, I've I've not yet been successful into gathering Denise into a psychologically and emotionally safe enough relationship in which she would feel comfortable to spontaneously start speaking to me. And that reframes the whole thing. And actually, I think that's a much more empowering narrative for practitioners, for parents, for families. It's not something's wrong with the child that needs to be fixed, but what can I be doing differently to create that relational context where there is a spontaneous melting into relationship and a receptivity to actually what is needed for someone to grow and heal. And parents are actually in the best position with young people to be able to do that. And once we start shifting a little bit in that direction, and this is the feedback we've got from a lot of practitioners, is that it reduces burnout for people because we're moving more relationally. Go ahead, Chanel, you want to jump in?
It really does. I think about my work at the Maples in support of young people, meeting 150 youth in a year. And there's so much pressure on practitioners as well. And I think our care teams, there was young people that we just struggled with. And it kind of eats away at you a little bit when you have all this care and this attention that you want to like give to a young person, and they're not receptive. And I did see in our care teams, myself included, we start to kind of problematize ourselves like, oh, I need this additional training, or I must, maybe the young person, they're just not a fit for our service. But as we had conversations around like these practices to sort of deepen relationship and render young people receptive, we had new eyes to see the young people that we had struggles with. And it was really empowering because it sort of gave our care teams like this boost of like, okay, we haven't gathered this young person and now we're going to get creative because the 5 ways that we've tried haven't worked. But there's many more ways, and it's so dependent on the particular youth. Um, and so that felt really good, working in care teams where that focus was shifted, and it was very empowering to kind of collectively, collaboratively find our way, rather than just have it be like, oh, this kid, they're a problem, or they don't fit the service that we want to provide.
They're not a good fit for this particular service or that, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the window becomes, that's what happened where we were working in this treatment center is the window became very narrow. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, very few kids actually fit the service that was being provided because the problems were too complex. So this is the framework, but I want you to imagine that it's three-dimensional. It's like Chanel gave me this beautiful analogy. It's like a mobile, like a baby's mobile hanging above a crib, and that there's all these pieces, and each piece is dynamic and working together. It's a holistic model, and you can enter at any point of the framework. You can start anywhere with it, and its applications are vast. But in order to learn it, we actually have to take it apart one piece at a time. And we have to be able to explore and have discussions to reflect and to apply it to cases. So I want you to just take a look at this because I'm going to go through, I've got some other slides prepared with descriptions and questions that I sent out in advance. Sydney, I'm wondering, did those slides get sent out or did you want me to pop the PDF in the chat? I didn't actually ask about that. I'm sure people would love the slides. Most people love having copies of, yeah. Oh, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I will see if I can put it in the chat right now.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Let's see.
So the first part of the framework I want to talk about is the gray ring around the outside. And it's gray because this is the piece that makes the framework transcultural. This is the piece that, depending on where we are and who we're working with, whether that's a particular Indigenous community or a family, what we want to do is we want to be asking ourselves, what is the cultural context of a particular community and family? What makes it distinct and different from others? How do we learn about those things? What are the place-based traditions of the people that we serve? And how are we creating a relational context? How are we actually doing that first and foremost? That is really the first thing we always have to do is create that relational context and then find ourselves within it. Now, we can't live in that place all the time because we have to do other things. The world is very work oriented. And so it's something that we intentionally have to be asking ourselves in all that we do, whether it's with one other person or with a group of people or with a whole community. What is my role in creating a relational context? How am I doing that? What is my way of doing that? And how do I know that I've been successful in doing that? I want to just touch on this because we talk about kinship and gathering our medicine. I'm going to come back to the outer ring, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But this is really important because gathering our medicine is informed by developmental attachment theory, developmental psychology, neuroscience, ethics of care, and all of the research done in Indigenous peoples' healing and trauma-informed care. But one thing that most of the literature doesn't capture, especially mental health literature, is Indigenous concepts of kin that go far beyond traditional attachment theory. Traditional attachment theory has to do mostly with baby bonding and physical connection, but it does not actually account for or give any insight into what can be done when physical connection is no longer possible for whatever reason. There's many reasons. That's the thing about being creatures of attachment and being relational, is that we will be hurt by the people we're connected to. We will lose people for one reason or another. In being connected and attached, we simultaneously face separation. And that's what makes relationships so darn vulnerable. If we're close to our heart and we're close to our senses, we know on some level that we will eventually lose the people we love. Now, what's really beautiful about Indigenous worldviews is we hold that existential condition as sacred. But we also provide other pathways for holding on to connection in the face of profound loss and separation, through the land, through the knowledges, through the more than human world, and through the ancestors. So when you're embedded within an Indigenous worldview, there is no such thing as separation. And I think that that's pretty incredible. It gives us something to hold on to no matter what. Chanel, did you want to say?
Well, I wanted to share not too long ago, I lost my kokom, which is Cree for grandmother. And I don't know what it is about the Cree people, but both of my communities, my grandmother and grandfather's communities, are named after birds. I know that Denise got to meet my kokom maybe about 3 years ago on Zoom. Um, Teaching maybe 50 people and talking, let Kokom know that we have a presentation. And she's like, come and look at these birds. And so I think of something like, it's just so simple, but my little hummingbird visitors that come, like these are ways in which I feel that connection with my grandmother, even though she's no longer physically with us. And this is just a really small kind of family teaching about like holding on. There is no separation. Um, but at least in my culture, I can think of all of the different narratives that have had me in my growing up feeling connected to my ancestors. It's like my family's way of being. My grandfather, he's right here. My mushum passed away when my mom was just small, but my family really kept him alive in the family stories and in our gatherings, our get-togethers. We have a ritual of like feeding our ancestors when we feast together. Um, and so I've always felt really connected to my mushum, even though I never physically met him. And it was because of some of our cultural and familial ways that really provided a sense of like um, being connected to my mushum, to my ancestors, folks I've never met, the place that I come from. Um, and then I have this deep longing in my work with young people where they don't have those yet, or maybe yeah, there's like this disconnection. How can we heal that rupture so that they're hearing the stories of their ancestors or of place, or their own cultural teachings, that are sort of restorative to that feeling connected and a part of something bigger than just ourselves?
Yeah, and the research tells us how important that sense of continuity is to identity formation. And so each and every community, that's the beauty of it. There's such beautiful diversity. Each and every community will have their own creation stories. They will have their own rituals and rites of passage, their own ceremonies, their own stories. Um, in order to provide that sense of continuity. And if we're working with Indigenous peoples, we're obliged, I think, obligated to get curious about and to value and to embody humility so that we can learn what those things are. I think, and I feel for all of us in this field, because there's so much pressure to get results. And so we don't have enough time. We're not afforded the kind of time we need to be able to do the work in the way we probably would like to. Pressure to achieve those results. And so we're rushing in, and we're going against what Statlium Elder Jerry Ullman told me once: we suffer because we break our own laws. And what that really means is when we go against our own internal values and what we know is needed, we suffer. And I think that's why there's so much burnout. So this idea that elders, ancestors, kinship, and place, these are sources of knowledge, and they provide that continuity that is so important for all of us. So I want to circle back around to creating the context in that outer ring. And I'm looking at the time, it's 11:05. I have a number of slides I really want to get through. So forgive me if I'm going much faster than I normally do, by the way. I feel like my rate of speech is fast, but I want to give you as much as I possibly can, knowing that there's so much more we could talk about. The outer gray ring of the framework reminds us to create and protect, and this is just what I've put in for my own community, okay? A distinctly Skokomish space for learning, healing, and growing together. What does that look like? Protecting, right? That's what the circle represents, by the way. The circle is a liminal space in which everything sort of stops. It's a sacred space in which we step into, and it is a space where there's no beginning and there's no end, and we get suspended in this space. And that space protects and preserves time for connection and togetherness. It shouldn't be a space for working and making progress. It should be a space that it brings people to rest, deep rest in the nervous system, relational rest, not putting people to work. I will say to the folks who work with this framework in community, whether they're doing it in practice as a counselor or whether they're doing group work with families, that if you can provide relational rest to our families, you'll probably be doing more for them than anyone else ever has. Because when we experience rest in relationship, when the nervous system truly rests, that's when we grow and heal. That's usually when the tears start to fall. We all need that. We all need time and space for that. If we don't have it, we actually lose what makes us humane. We become quite prickly. We lose our empathy. We lose our instincts about how to care for one another. We become defended, and we often alienate ourselves. It's a space where emotions can move freely without consequence. We live in a society today that's emotion phobic, and emotions lead to social alienation, and that's part of the problem. The role of emotions neurobiologically is to bring us closer into relationship. It's supposed to send a signal to our fellow humans, help me, and to bring us closer together. But we live in a society in which big noisy emotions, especially, my beautiful auntie who was married for over 50 years lost her husband recently, and she's really, really struggling. This is on the non-Indigenous side of my family. This is someone who's been very strong her whole life, incredibly independent, very high functioning. She's into the third or fourth year now after losing my uncle. She's really struggling, and she's starting to open up a little bit. And I said, your generation was never given the opportunity to exercise feeling emotions. You were never given the opportunities to build a capacity to tolerate your own affect. You really just need to cry, and you need to give yourself space to feel. And she, I could see she's like, she said, you're right. Like that, just, we were sent away. We were alienated when we had emotions. But we now know, no, we are emotional beings, deep primal emotion. And when we have tears or we're in distress, it is a cry for others to come close and to bring us in close. And so that outer circle represents a space where all emotions are invited and we stay together in it. We take care of each other in that space. It's a space in which the sharing of culturally distinct and affirming messages about our way of life can be shared by the elders and the knowledge keepers. What are the stories? What are the stories about the great adversity our people have always faced and all of the ways in which going through adversity was necessary to reach our potential? Not narratives of like, not this is what Gordon told me once, and I thought this was so profound. And this was after I lost my husband as well to cancer about 7 years ago. And he said, as I was trying to figure out how to take care of my own two young boys, he said, Denise, not all not all tragedies must become traumas. We've always had tragedy. They're meant to be integrated, but we have to have a process for digesting the experiences. And culture has always provided processes that are culturally distinct for normalizing and digesting and integrating difficult things so that we didn't get stuck. It's a space where we get to not only provide care to others, but receive care from another. Now, that sounds like it's really easy, and we all can say, oh, yeah, I know what that means. Most people in the helping profession are good at providing care, but they're not very good at receiving it. And then we complain that no one provides any care to us, but quite frankly, we just don't receive it. We're more comfortable providing. It's vulnerable to receive care. And if we've been hurt, there can be defense mechanisms, protective mechanisms there that actually, it's not rational at all. It just doesn't sink in the way it should when someone tries to care for us. Now, how many kids or families have you worked with where you have all the love in the world and all the care in the world, but it's like Teflon and it's just not sinking in? Yeah, that's because of the defenses, and that takes time. It takes continuity, it takes time, it takes carving out these circles over and over and over again and inviting people into these safe places and spaces for a time repeatedly until such time as the brain deems it safe and melts the defenses and makes one available for care again. Not rational at all. Um, it's a context that is safe, inclusive, and where there is a beginning and an ending. And so that's really important because we're not meant, we have different modes. We have a work mode, we have a play mode, and we have a rest mode. And there's a time for work, and there's a time for play, and there's a time for rest. Part of the problem is we live in a world where the work mode is what's taken over. So we work at our rest, we work at our play, we work at our well-being, we work at our parenting, we work, 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 and that's the problem. Um, and the space is intended to protect the important from the urgent. And a space for us to slow down as well. Slowing down, I think, is probably the most radical decolonizing act we can do. It's a radical act of resistance, actually, to slow down and become present and to become available to another human being. I'm going to keep going. Is it okay? Give me a thumbs up. I feel I'm talking at lightning speed here. Okay, great. Any questions at all coming into the chat? No? There
I'm
must
not
be.
seeing questions.
Any
People are
comments?
sharing some personal stories.
Did you want to
Um,
share a couple of comments, Sydney? That would be lovely.
Melanie shared that her father passed 3 years ago, and since then she's had a cardinal come to her backyard, and just feeling that connection that you were referring to, just really, really beautiful. Yeah, yeah.
About birds.
And sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You go.
Pauline is saying it's such a great message. So we're intrigued to learn more. That's what I'm feeling. I feel like we're all just sort of on the edge of our seat or just fully in your space here, Denise. So you've got us. So
Good. Okay, beautiful. I'll keep going then. And I just want to comment about the birds. I mean, for us, birds are
mhm.
really powerful messengers. And I just want to point out, see how intuitive it is. Like when we lose someone, it's like we feel that connection with those visitors. It's in us to do that. There's a deep knowing in us about this. So that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Um, at the center, I want to go zoom into the center of the framework in the heart, the words being and becoming. Um, and that, has to do with asking the question of what is it to be and become? What is the developmental process that we know is universal? And then how do specific cultures facilitate that developmental process? And how can families and communities in their own way provide the conditions for development to unfold? Now, if you're a developmentalist, you look at potential. As developmentalists, we don't, and in all Indigenous people are developmentalists. We may not have had that word in the long ago. That's a contemporary word. Um, but we were developmentalists because we had a great faith in nature's and way and in life force energy that runs in all things, and that if we provide the conditions, nature will do what is intended to do. Uh, and a person or any being will reach their potential when the relational conditions are there. This is different than looking at sort of like what are all the things that happen to someone that cause them to have particular set of symptoms, and now how do we deal with these symptoms? How do we mitigate the symptoms or reduce the symptoms so this person can get back to functioning? We're really inviting communities and families to consider, well, as a Skokomish person, what is the mark of a developed person in our community? What are we looking for? And often there's these other universal messages in Indigenous worldviews around uh, respect, generosity, humility, courage, integrity, wisdom. And then there's all these what we call protocols and knowledges to support the developmental process that lead a person, the inner cultivation of a person so they become like this. As a Skokomish person, I find it really interesting that our focus was never on teaching anything until there was enough development present, that we would observe young people to see if they were integrated. Were they far enough along in their developmental process? Was there enough inner cultivation of the human being before we started to give knowledge to them? We live in a world today where we fill people up with knowledge, but we've failed to cultivate the inner being. And what we've got is we've got people running around with knowledge, and they're using it in maybe unintentionally harmful ways or in ways that might be unethical. Because intelligence and the inner cultivation and maturity of someone, those are two different things. We can be very bright, we can lack inner cultivation. So being and becoming has to do with that inner cultivation process, um, and and envisioning, reimagining different definitions of what it means to be human in the world today, depending on the community.
I think this is a really beautiful place to, like, when we were working in community, all different communities in support of young people who might be experiencing mental health challenges, elders, knowledge carriers, community members, they might feel like, well, we don't know how to help because we don't really know about anxiety and depression, and we don't have those insights. And so we're not really useful. But when we talk about, no, actually, our target or what we're talking about or what we are working towards is how does this young person be and become who they're meant to, with like as a Skokomish young person or as a Cree young person, the elders and the family members or community members light up because they're full of ideas of like how to cultivate those things. And all of a sudden there's a way in for them to be useful.
Well, and I love that you mentioned depression too, because like, I mean, like all the big things we're dealing with, like depression, anxiety, self-harming, suicidal ideation, addiction, substance use, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. But in particular, the narrative that we've heard around depression as being a season and that needs to be normalized. And there's a lovely book, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it's called Wintering, and it talks just about that. Yeah, and it's like, where are the narratives that help normalize the human experience as opposed to pathologize it? Um, Togetherness is part of, so you see, there's these four words here. I don't want to skip over that. There's four words. You'll see the kinship circle. I talked about kinship earlier, are the beings at the center around the heart of the child or the heart of the community. And that represents everyone, including helping practitioners. It's families, it's siblings, it's extended kinship, it's anyone in a family's life, whether they're from the community or not, that's caring for the family. But on the outside of that are these four really intuitive words: care, togetherness, rest, and movement. And these are the theoretical constructs, the evidence-based theories that inform this framework. Okay, so this is where we've really integrated Western science, medical science, mental health science, into a framework that centers community, kinship, and culture. And that's what makes it a little bit unique, is the integration in the way it is. It's informing what we do, but it's not at the center of what we do. It's not driving what we do. So what do we mean by togetherness? Those are my two boys, by the way, and my partner at a puberty rites ceremony a few years back in our backyard. And my son standing on the blanket with the blue blanket around him, and community coming. And it was so hot that day. It was probably one of the hottest days of the summer. And he stood there for a couple of hours on this blanket as he was given teachings and words from family and community about his identity, about the process of growing up, about the challenges. He was being given advice and teachings. And he's 13 here. And he stood there with such, and I watched through the day as his head went from like being down to just this sense of pride, shoulders back, back straight up, and face up, because he was being acknowledged by his own people. He was being cared for by his own people. And his deep need, the deep need that we all have for a sense of belonging, a sense of mattering, feeling loved, feeling understood, were being met on that day. And I can imagine all the beautiful brain chemicals, his brain's being bathed in as he's being unconditionally showered. He is in a passive position. He needs to do nothing but receive. Very beautiful. But what do we mean by togetherness? Well, relationships where the need for connection, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and even spiritually, is provided without disruption, where emotional expression is invited, frustration and tears, and does not interfere with togetherness. Relationships are a source of rest, because a child does not have to work or perform for adults to belong and feel loved and understood. And it's everywhere, this work mode in the school system, in the mental health. Like, let's put these kids to work. Let's use rewards. Let's use consequences. Let's condition. This puts the child in the driver's seat. There's a big difference between getting consent from a young person and asking a young person to tell you what it is they need. And that is such a typical thing in the field of adolescent mental health. Let's get the child to tell us what their needs are. Let's involve them in the case planning. Well, when it comes, there's a lot of things a kid can tell us about and could be involved in, but when it comes to their deepest relational needs, that's not one of them. We provide, it's not meant to be talked about. And care is provided and received unconditionally. Our children must feel our love and understanding deeply, and defenses must be melted. So I'm going to pause there because it's 11:24 and I want to give a little bit of room if there's questions. I didn't get through all the slides. I'm sorry. I did my best. It's hard to do. But maybe we'll run into each other again at some point.
I certainly hope so. Am I unmuted? I am. Okay. I've just been sitting here enraptured, and so many things have landed with me that I'm processing. But I am not seeing any questions in the chat. So would just love to hold space for everybody to be in a bit of conversation with Denise and Chanel for the next few minutes. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, please feel free to just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. You could use the raise hand function if you want. I will tell you, Denise, while people are thinking, that there have been a lot of, not just in the chat, but we have our virtual board, that you're also welcome to click on that link at any time if you want. But people have been just noticing some key takeaways that like we suffer when we break our own laws, that you talked about work, play, and rest, right? Or sort of in that work has taken over, relationship as a place of rest. Take the journey from the head to the heart really stuck out with a few people. So that's just some of what's landed on our board right now. Love
it.
Yeah.
I love this is a great tool to use online, interactive tool. I can see everyone's on there moving around right now. So I would love to see the end result of this. If you could share it with us, we'd so appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely. Something that occurred to me while you were speaking in terms of people having a hard time accepting care. And I've really noticed in the people that I'm holding space with and working with, a lot of times what I'm hearing from them is that there's a sense of, I don't deserve to be cared for. Is that something that you've noticed? I mean, what I think I heard from you is that we don't live in a culture that honors that. So we almost don't know how to accept it when it's directed to us. But I wonder if you've noticed that sense of self-worth plays a role in that, in our ability to accept care.
I certainly think so. I feel like we do live in a world. There's a climate psychologist who I really appreciate by the name of Sally Weintraub, and she talks about how the dominant sphere, she calls it, that we're all in, like in this sphere, it actually effectively works to uncare us starting at a very young age.
Right.
Uncaring process is actually necessary for us to participate in the way the world is. If we were feeling all our feelings, it would be too painful to look at what's happening. And those of us who are highly empathic know that we feel, you'll know we feel the suffering of the whole world. It can be unbearable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? We want to shut it off, and our kids are certainly doing that. But we also live in a world that's performance-based, and so we do make the mistake of conditioning our children very young. We show them that when they perform for us, then they matter, and when they do not perform, they do not matter. This is, I mean, we're not saying this to them, but this is how
what we're demonstrating.
They're demonstrating this. And so when we're working with people, there is this cognitive piece, of course, this psychological piece, right? The higher mind says, oh, I'm not worthy. But it doesn't matter if you can sneak past the defenses in a relationship and give another human being a touch of mattering. That will start to heal spontaneously.
I get it. And I think it's an interesting invitation for us. We're all folks here who offer community-based programs to vulnerable families across Ontario, and there's folks here from other provinces as well across Canada. And like, I really wonder how can we, in the relationships that we foster with families, parents, children, and communities, maybe hold that place of rest a little bit. I love when you say that relationships is a place of rest, and what would that look like within our sphere of opportunity of building relationships? with families. So I don't know, but it's a question.
Well, maybe I can comment on that. I can be sort of my closing.
Oh,
I think
I would
it's a
love that.
I think it's a lovely invitation. I think take that seriously.
Mhm.
What I can tell you is you must practice your theory. Part of one of the other problems with the way
Okay.
the world is that we have theories that we don't live. And so we,
Theories that we don't live. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so if we want to practice relationally, we need to become that way here with each other. We
Mhm.
need to become that way in our agencies and in our life.
Mhm.
Healing the wounded healer. I mean, we need healing too, right? We're no different.
Yeah.
Like the degree of separation between the people we're helping that are suffering and ourselves. We suffer too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Chanel, Denise, just thank you so very much. I just feel like we've been in a space of beautiful, deep wisdom that is just flowing with compassion and love, and you've got the hearts coming up now. So glad that you could join us today, and I'm feeling very, I don't know, strange, moved in ways that I can't quite yet verbalize, but thankful. Thank you. And I'm seeing thank yous in the chat, and certainly gratitude on our board here. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and hear from you. And I do hope our paths can cross again, and we can continue learning from what you've pulled together in your work and your wisdom. So thanks.
Thank you, OC, and my hands go up to all of you and all the work you're
Okay.
doing. You're so needed and
Mm.
it's not easy. And so I just want to hold my hands up to you and say thank you to each and every one of you for what you do to help families.
Mm.
Take really good care. Enjoy the rest of
We
your
will.
time.
We will. I will stop recording now.